have loss in our life, whether it was death or the loss of a job, relationships. In my practice, it's loss of a childhood. So I'm dealing with a lot of adults who had abusive caregivers, and they're grieving their childhood that they never had. This can definitely reopen wounds of loss.
Right.
And if theme of loss is something that's in there, this could definitely reopen wounds if they've never been dealt with.
Welcome everyone to our podcast called Renew Your Mind. With us today, we have a large group today. We have Senior Pastor Paul Gruenberg. We have retired Pastor Barry Sweet. We have our Youth and Family Director and also contemporary praise band leader, Jordan Kettlewell. We have Julie Kettlewell, very special guest, a grief educator, and we now have Jessie Thompson. And if you could introduce yourself, that would be great. And then I'll kick us off.
Okay, I am a licensed clinical therapist, and I have an office here at our church, and I see lots of kids, families, teens, counseling.
Great. Yeah, and you can tell that we're not totally professional by my misspoken. Yeah.
And you might, Julie, if you want to introduce yourself
Julie,
again, this is
yeah.
a new podcast.
I am Julie Kettlewell, and I am a certified grief educator. And my goal and my purpose is to raise the bar on grief literacy and normalize conversations about grief and loss and death. And it's what I do.
Okay.
So we've had
Thank you.
this long series of podcasts on grief and mental health, and we've had the expert and the expert, and then the expert and the expert, and we're finally bringing you two together with the long-awaited moment. This is exciting.
Way to make them so nervous, Jordan.
No, this is exciting. The moment we've all been waiting for.
Well, we did chat beforehand. We wanted to better understand the differences between trauma and grief and possibly how they intersect with one another. So maybe, I don't know if Jessie, you want to define trauma and then Julie grief, or one of you just go, please.
Yeah, no, let's do the trauma because somebody said to me, it might have been a week or so ago, everyone is calling everything trauma. Everything is trauma all the time. You know, I don't know if it's on these reality shows where they're always looking for some kind of trauma. But what really is trauma, Jessie? I mean, when do we move from a comment, that was so stupid, or somebody does something to us then that we are able to just move past to something we call trauma? Because when I think of trauma, I think of people who have experienced difficult moments, a car accident, you know, something sudden like that, or people who serve in first responding type of situations or the military. That's trauma. I mean, those are like traumatic things. And then someone says, I broke my fingernail, I'm in trauma. And when do we cross the line to trauma? Or is trauma like really a personal level of whatever that is?
It's complex. I think in previous podcasts we've defined it, but I think it's just complex. So it is, yes, it's personal, it's relative. There are leaders in the trauma field who've defined it as anything that's not nurturing. And so I've broke that down a little bit more because that could be anything. That could be a broken fingernail, but there's levels of trauma too. So when we're dealing with traumatic events and people who are dealing with what we call post-traumatic stress disorder or anything that affects our mental health, trauma is really an upsetting, confusing event. So it's that. So it's something that's unpredictable. It's something we weren't expecting. It's something that is disruptive to our system, our mind, body, and spirit, our system. And it can be not nurturing in that it's impacting the development of our brain, our body, our our spiritual development. It impacts that to a visceral level. And so I'm always defining it as if it triggered your survival response system, your stress response system, where you're in fight, flight, or freeze, where adrenaline and cortisol are pumping through your body, we all know that feeling, then it was traumatic to you. And we've talked about this too, but it's so important to say it again, it's relative. So what is traumatizing to me will not necessarily be traumatizing to you. It really depends on our upbringing, our biology, our families, our previous experiences, our foundation, if we have a relationship with Christ or if we don't. There are some people who truly are not set up to deal with trauma. So that word is thrown out because it is a buzzword right now as our field is developing more and more education is being researched on it, which is really important. But just like with anything else, it kind of takes away the gravity of it when we throw it around with, I broke my fingernail, so traumatic. I hear it all the time. Even my girls, that was traumatic, what you said to me. I'm like, okay. So it's...
Well, I think there's, so yes, I mean, anything, the wrong word spoken to the wrong person at the wrong time can be traumatic. Like whatever small thing that is. I think, though, there is, because of the overuse of the word, and people just generally, I mean, kids and adults just kind of overlabel everything. What they actually mean is drama, not trauma.
Yes.
That was dramatic, not traumatic, but it's still, and I love the way you described it in the earlier pod with the window, which helped me because I'm like, I'm emotionally, my window is wide and I've been through a lot of trauma. So when I hear people say like, oh, somebody said a mean thing and I'm traumatized, I'm like, all right. Okay. But that helped me understand.
Well, in our culture today, we call people snowflakes, and which is dismissive on lots of levels. But on some levels, it's true, too. And trying to find that difference between trauma, and that's where it's unique to each one of us, probably, is that, I may look at somebody else as being, come on, give me a break. You're just dramatizing this, as opposed to, this is real pain for you and real trauma for you. And it's hard for us to determine that.
So, Julie, what can you try to define grief again for us so we can kind of pair those up against each other?
Well, in its simplest terms, grief is just a period in your life that you go through where you are suffering a loss and you have a pervading sense of sadness and which can actually move into depression or isolation. But in general, you are in mourning and grieving a death or a loss of some sort. And again, to clarify that a little bit, loss is not necessarily a death. It can be a loss of, a home or a job or your, financial security, your relationships, your, so it's such a wide topic that almost never ending. And as far as grief as it relates to trauma, I think it's important to note that trauma always comes with grief attached. Grief does not always have trauma attached to it. And when the first time I heard that, I thought, wait a minute, I need to put this in writing so I can look at it, because it started making a circle in my head.
Math wasn't working out.
Yeah, it was not. It was not computing in my brain. And now that I understand it better, I see that it makes perfect sense, because anytime you're traumatized, there's probably been a loss or an injury or some sort of something that just rocked your world, and which will immediately activate that grief part of you. Now, that doesn't mean...
But does it activate it immediately? I don't...
Well, it activates it, but you might not realize that that's what's happening, that you're in grief over what transpired in that trauma, or what caused that trauma.
Can I actually, I thought about this just now as you're saying that. Jessie, you said within your definition, anything that's causing on the emotional level that fight, flight, or freeze. So fight, I'm going to overcome this. Probably not a whole lot of grief involved. Flight, I'm going to be in denial of this. Probably not a whole lot of grief involved. Freeze, I feel like is where emotional trauma might end up with grief, because you're at that point in like stasis in that moment.
Right. Well,
does that make sense?
It does, but and I might also liken it to the tornado that hit here a couple years ago. And unfortunately, we lost a couple community members in that tragedy, and there was huge loss of property, and families were pulled apart temporarily because they had to be placed in temporary housing. And there was an awful lot of grief as a community. It was collective grief. But I think everybody, to a certain extent, experienced that grief personally, too, because this is our community. It happened to us. And it didn't happen to me personally, it happened to us. So you still feel that grief. That was traumatic, and it activated grief feelings in everyone who lives in this community. So, and it's like, Jordan, you said somebody might say something to you, the younger people, everything's traumatic. Somebody says something and you go, oh, that was so traumatic. But in some instances, too, somebody might say something which in itself is not traumatic, but it could activate an old wound, an old trauma. And so, the kids that throw this word around, they don't even realize that there is some truth in what they're saying when they go, oh, I was so traumatized. Well, maybe somewhere they were, but mostly, yes, you're right. They mean dramatic, but words can activate those old wounds, and those old wounds is where the part about grief doesn't always come with trauma. Trauma always comes with grief, but grief, if it was a peaceful death, it's most likely there's not going to be any trauma attached to that. And by a peaceful death, I'm talking about, somebody that's been in hospice or they're very elderly, and you're with them you're with them and walk with them when they cross over, okay, when they pass. So most likely you'll feel peaceful about that death and not traumatized. But in another instance, there might be a tragic accident and there will be trauma attached.
Sure.
Other times, I'm going to complicate this even further, it might not be traumatic, it might not be peaceful, it might be somewhere in between there, but in that grieving process, old wounds start popping up. And when those old wounds start popping up, it complicates the grief and takes way longer to heal. So at that point in time, it almost becomes mandatory that you have to start isolating those old wounds, and they may go back all the way to childhood. And all of a sudden something's activated because that person died, and there's a connection.
So even fight or flight, which it might not present immediately with grief, can trigger grief down the road. As we reflect on that event or we deal with it, hours later or days later.
And that grief is tied to something that happened prior.
Right.
Well, the immediate grief, that acute grief, is tied to that death that just occurred, or that loss. As you start moving out of that acute stage and into the early stages of grief, and you're finding that you start getting stuck and you just can't move forward, and you can't get outside, you can't get out of those night jammies into the day jammies like we talked about. You just go into a state of inertia, or you just can't think straight, and you just don't want to be around anybody. Some old wounds are probably resurfacing.
I don't know. I see them so intertwined. I can't even separate them.
They are,
So
but when you're
that's-
grieving, you don't recognize that right away.
And that's what I was going
I
to
don't know.
ask.
I mean,
is-
yeah. I
Or
can't
going through
separate
the
them.
trauma, you're not going to recognize it right away.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So listening
think.
to, and I'm trying to put together thoughts from prior pods that we've done, but so listening to all that, what you're kind of saying too is if there's trauma not involved with the loss that's causing the grief, if the grief isn't dealt with, or it's compounded on something else, the symptomatic response is the same one way or the other, because what you've described, hopefully I've got my terminology right, sounds to me basically like a complex or cumulative post-traumatic stress disorder. Is that?
Yes,
I mean, when you're
in a
talking
way
about
it is.
like one catalyst that's unraveling all of this
Yes.
stuff, even though so now you're feeling years worth of
Yeah.
things
The
because of
dominoes.
this one
Yeah.
thing. So now we're into an incident that was maybe not inherently traumatic, or we're still having to treat it with a trauma response. Is
Right.
that fair to say? To bring both worlds together here?
I was
Kind
gonna-
of.
yeah. Well, do you see it the same way that Julie is, where they intertwine, or do you have a different take on it, Jessie, or different thoughts pop into your head?
I'm processing. So
yeah, and I'm sorry, I'm
I-
not trying to put you on the
No,
spot.
I think that to back up a little, because we started with the freeze response, and I think we can call that delayed grief. Just how the trauma overtakes, if it's a traumatic loss, the trauma, the fight, flight, that all takes over first. And then the grieving process needs to kick in later. But if we bypass it, which we do in our culture so much, which we've discussed this, there is no cultural norm for grieving. We are so busy. We got to rush. We got to get on to the next thing. So there's a lot of pushing down. And I think I'm hearing you say too, like it's just uncomfortable to grieve, and we struggle with that. So it is a natural response to push that stuff down. And so when we are traumatized again by a different loss, maybe the like you said, the loss itself isn't traumatic, but if it's still living, if we have loss in our life, whether it was death or the loss of a job, relationships, in my practice, it's loss of a childhood. So I'm dealing with a lot of adults who had abusive caregivers, and they're grieving their childhood that they never had. This can definitely reopen wounds of loss.
Right.
In my counseling, we are looking for themes in their lives. Like they do timelines, and they tell me, okay, yep, I have a theme of loss, or I have a theme of abandonment, or I have a theme of abuse. And if theme of loss is something that's in there, this could definitely reopen wounds if they've never been dealt with.
So when you have grief and you've grieved and you've come out to the very bad terms, but you've come out the other side of grief. Let's say you've got back into
Acceptance.
functioning, acceptance. That grief is still with you. Julie, you've said that
Right.
once you start,
You've just grown bigger than the grief.
so you've grown to a point where you can manage it. But that grief can come back in waves depending on what you experience in the future.
Yes,
Life is so complex.
Yes, it is.
it is. But we are called to deal with these things
That's
head
right.
on and to deal with and heal with them as we're doing and as we're in it, and not wait. That's what we're called to do as a church for our people too. And when we don't, that's the fallout.
Right.
That's the fallout.
Right.
Yeah, and maybe that's how we should wrap up this podcast, is reminding our listeners how we help people and ourselves deal with that. I don't know if that's not a very good word, but what's our job? Not our job, but what can we do to help others or understand others? or listen to others? Somebody jump in because I'm
Well,
just
and
going
even
nowhere.
where does faith kick in
Exactly.
in this journey as well?
So, it seems to me as I've listened, and, both of you, Julie and Jessie, the key that I keep hearing is listening. Be a witness to what the person is going through so they know they're not alone, which is a direct correlation that we're never alone.
That's right.
God is always with us. So that as a church, as we remind people that they are loved right where they're at, that God is walking with you through this, that God is not passively watching. God is entering into the hurt, to the suffering. God suffers along with us because God is a personal God. When we can, I think, as a church, help people to understand that God didn't smite them, God didn't, cause this to happen. There's a couple other things I'm thinking of that just really irritate me about church. But that God continually walks with us through this. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for God is with me. Thy rod and thy staff.
How do we help the person receive that and claim it?
I think part of that's the witness is walking with them through that, listening,
Presence.
and I think it's affirming that it's okay.
And modeling.
Yeah, modeling
model
being
that.
there for them, and,
Right,
and
modeling.
maybe representing
Maybe.
God to them.
Yeah, maybe we need to not only listen to that person, but listen to what God wants to share with that person.
Sure.
And
I don't know. I think that comes with, because Julie, we were talking beforehand, and I think Jessie, you'll affirm this, that our role would be then to just be asking door opening questions and allowing people to process in the presence of someone else to be that witness.
And when they're ready, they may ask us.
When they're ready to receive, then they'll ask
Then
the
maybe they'll
question.
begin to ask some questions of us.
Would that be I mean, for the everyday Christian, would that be the thing to do?
I think the best thing to do is not talk too much.
Right.
And, we aren't giving guidance. We aren't over spiritualizing. We aren't doing those things because they do not hear it.
Right.
We just need to sit in the muck with them. So sometimes that
Amen.
means saying nothing, but we're with them.
Right.
That's right.
We're with
and
them.
I think that's what everybody was trying to say.
They need a connection of some sort, even if you don't say a word.
There was a person in one of my congregations that I didn't realize it for a while was really hurting and struggling. And eventually I heard about it through the grapevine, and it took me about a week to get there. And her first comment to me is, "I knew you'd come," which made me feel terrible that I'd waited so long. But I knew you'd come because I represented, as her pastor, somewhat God to her, and that listening presence. She was waiting for me to show up, and I didn't realize it. I didn't know about it for quite a while, but so I felt bad about it, but it taught me some lessons. Just those few words, "I knew you'd come."
But that was your timeline, right?
Well, it was my timeline was
When
way
you felt
behind.
guilty.
Oh, yeah.
Why? Yeah. Why would you feel guilty if you didn't know?
Because of her need that she was waiting.
Right. Did she let you know that you
She
were waiting?
didn't. Which
So
is,
then-
and that happens a lot in ministry,
Right.
where people
Yeah.
think we have a crystal ball on our desk that tells us.
You don't?
No,
Oh my gosh.
I never had one. You have one?
It's in the drawer.
Oh, okay.
Of course I do.
Collecting dust.
But I just felt awful at that moment that
Yeah.
I felt like I failed her, but I did show up and everything was fine.
And she's demonstrating grace
Yeah.
to you. Yes.
Yeah.
In
Very
her
much so.
grief.
In her grief.
Like, how powerful is that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she found gratitude in that. See?
She did.
Everything comes full
the timing,
circle.
timing was perfect, but I just didn't know it. But it took me a while to process that whole situation from a pastoral perspective and a caretaking perspective.
Well, thank you.
And the biggest thing that obviously that came away from that, the the most important thing to that person was you showed up.
Right.
Everything
It wasn't
after that,
anything I
probably
said.
not. Yeah.
It was presence.
Just that you showed up.
Sitting in the muck.
right.
And so that, I think, probably in a
Yeah.
nutshell is what we need to do, is we need to
Yeah.
show up.
Just show up.
Absolutely. I learned a
So
lot from that.
That's
So the follow-up question then would be, in sitting in the muck, because people in general, they want to help others. And so there's that, sitting in the muck can be really hard.
It isn't much fun.
And yeah, and you want to help that other person. So to me, the struggle for me is to ask the question, or to ask the right question, or to just not ask a question. I'm thinking, boy, we're going to be together for, maybe we got a half an hour or an hour appointment, and I want to help move people from point A to point B, and point B being one more step toward healing. And yet, sitting in the muck sometimes says you don't get to point B, in my
Right.
mind. But that might be point B in theirs.
Yep.
Yeah.
okay. Well, I think we'll wrap up this podcast. Thank you. Thank you to our very special guests, Julie and Jessie. And thank you very much to our listeners. If you have, any thoughts or questions, just let us know. We'd love to hear from you. We come to you from the Gaylord Methodist Church, and we have Sunday services, one at 9 a.m., a traditional service, and a contemporary at 10:45 a.m. We also have every second and fourth Wednesday an Encountering God service. And we just would love to have you in person if you could. If you can't come in person, though, you can see us on Facebook or YouTube. And if you have any questions, call the office at 989-732-5380, or you can Google us and check out our website. So thanks again, everybody, for listening to us today.